Good afternoon and welcome speakers and audience to the 5th webinar in the All Energy Decarbonised Virtual Summit and the 22nd one we've held since May. There are around 340 people gathered in our virtual audience for the climate emergency and planning. Have we got the balance right? I know that our chair for this session, George Baxter, Director of Development at Green Power, plans to set the scene, so I'm not going to nick his words of wisdom, but I would like to thank both Green Power International and SSE Renewables for coming together to sponsor this session on something close to both their corporate hearts. I'm Judith Patton, Project Director of our duo of shows and the co-creator of All Energy way back at the start of the century. It's time for just a few housekeeping points. Whilst I talk briefly, my slide will help you get the best benefit possible during your time with us today and afterwards. It is important that if you would like to take part in a poll, and there will be 2 polls in this session, and to ask questions or rate this webinar, that you shrink your screen from full screen to be able to see where to do these things. And if you opt for attachments, you can see details of all 8 of the webinars being held during this virtual summit. Yesterday's are already available on demand viewing, and indeed so is the first one from today. And this one will be available later on today. This session demonstrates how important networking is, and something I know we're all sorely missing at the moment. We staged the resurgence of onshore wind as a webinar way back in June and held a poll asking the audience what topic they wanted us to address at the next one on onshore wind. The answer was clear: landscape and planning. I'd started talking with a few movers and shakers about the angle I should be taking when George spoke at another of our webinars held in August and touched on these topics. All our previous webinars are incidentally available on demand on the website. That enabled me to bounce some of my ideas off him and led to us working up today's programme. Thank you, George. I know we're going to have an interesting discussion over the next 90 minutes, and I'm delighted that one of your panelists proves that the sector is keen to involve the views of young people. Without more ado, I'd like to wish all of you here today and your families good health in these worrying times, and now pass over to George so that he can get the discussion underway.
Thank you very much, Judith, and thanks very much to All Energy for enabling this event. And thanks to all of you who've joined us today for what should be a fascinating discussion and hearing, obviously, from our very experienced and knowledgeable panel. By way of a reminder, our aim is to discuss the climate emergency and whether we really are getting the balance right in the planning system. The UK and Scottish targets are really bold, with expansion of onshore wind expected to treble in capacity over the next 10 to 15 years. So we need a supportive planning system that works really well and quickly. In addition, to make projects work on a commercially viable basis, whether that's a small community project or a large utility scale project, then the planning system simply has to accommodate the most efficient, modern, larger turbines. And as Judith said, previous polls at seminars highlight planning policy at the top of the list of challenges, and that's been for a number of years. Planning is seen as a crucial issue for many, many reasons. So the key questions for this seminar are: is Scotland dealing with the planning policy radically enough to match the urgency of the climate emergency? And that word radical is not mine, it's the First Minister when she spoke about the planning for reforms that are needed to tackle the climate emergency earlier in the year. And is policy being driven sufficiently by that climate emergency? And is the fact that onshore wind is supported by an overwhelming majority of people properly considered? Where does that balance lie between the visual effects on people and landscapes and the fact that climate change poses the greatest threat to those very same people and landscapes? So these are quite big questions. And landscape, of course, may not be the only issue, although it tends to be a recurring one that presents challenges. So before I pass over to speakers to provide a stimulus for this discussion, just to remind people, we hope to have plenty of time for a Q&A and really encourage you to engage on the chat. We'll be joined after the three main speakers for a Q&A session by Robbie Kernahan of Scotland's Natural Heritage Agency, Nature Scot, and Colm McHale, who is a young advisor to children in Scotland, who's joining us to give us a young person's view. We'll hear from our three main speakers first, but don't wait till the Q&A session. Please feel free to comment and ask questions throughout, and we'll do our best to include them. And as Judith said, there will be some opinion polling with a couple of questions. These are now live, and we'll run through the webinar, and we'll reveal the results of that when we get to the Q&A section. So get your vote in. It won't take 3 days before we learn the results, fortunately. So over to our speakers. First of all, I'd like to introduce Jennifer Ballantyne. Jennifer is a well-kent face in the energy sector. She's a property and consenting specialist who heads up the energy and infrastructure team at Pinsent Masons. She's also a board member of Scottish Renewables, the trade body for the renewable industry in Scotland, and leads for the board there on planning issues. So Jennifer, over to you. Give us your perspective, what you want to see happen to the planning balance to help the industry deliver on the climate emergency. I think you could be on mute there.
Classic.
Sorry,
there's always one.
You're with us now.
Yeah, sorry about that. Okay, do that again. Hello, good afternoon, everybody. So yeah, I was going to run through sort of a scorecard. Where are we now? Where do we need to get to? And what needs to change in order to try and get us there? The first slide I have is just a snapshot taken from Scottish Renewables' submission to the National Planning Framework 4 consultation, showing current energy use in Scotland. The upper quadrant there, electricity use, you will see we're at 90% of our electricity being generated from renewable sources. So that's a fantastic achievement by the industry in the last 20 years to get to 8 gigawatts of onshore wind, 1 gigawatt of offshore wind, solar, a number of different technologies represented in that figure. But the next gen of electricity generation is to drive the decarbonisation of the other 3 quadrants that you see, to drive the decarbonisation of transport with the introduction of electric vehicles, electric buses, and the decarbonisation of heating, whether that's directly using renewable electricity or whether it's using hydrogen, which might have been produced from renewable electricity. So in summary, electricity demand is going to go up, and the majority, all of that, needs to be sourced from low carbon fuel. And that is basically a quadrupling of renewable electricity generation in the period to 2045. So the line there that's highlighted, an increase in onshore wind in Scotland from the current 8 gigawatts of installed capacity to 24 gigawatts by 2035. So that's a trebling of current installed capacity in Scotland. And as I say, we've got to 8 gigawatts after 20 years of trying, but as George says, after many planning battles to get us there. So with a climate emergency and new targets, which require a trebling of capacity by 2035 as a staging post, never mind what we need to do to get to 2045, we need to greatly increase the rate of deployment of all renewable technologies, but onshore wind will be the main focus for growth and will remain so over the next 15 years. So what is our current build rate? I've got a slide here showing the build rates, the amount of new megawatt capacity which has come on stream in Scotland in the last 10 years. Total figure is 5 gigawatts, over 5 gigawatts of new capacity in the last 10 years. So roughly speaking, an annual average of 525 megawatts per annum. But as you can see, it's been very erratic. There's no set pattern necessarily, although you can see the influence of the coming and going perhaps of subsidy regimes. But potentially, most worryingly, 2019, last full year, we saw only 188 megawatts coming on stream, and this year to date, only 30 megawatts. Now, for to get to 24 gigawatts of capacity by 2035, and we're sitting at 8 just now, then even ignoring the need to retain and repower some of that existing capacity, some of which will get to end of life, that's a new 16 gigawatts of capacity we need by 2035, a rough build rate of 1 gigawatt per annum, and so far we're doing 525 megawatts per annum. So we're only halfway there. We need to double the average. And so how do we get there? We need policy support to encourage the growth of onshore wind in Scotland. Planning remains one of the major barriers to deployment. So it was going to require a major step change to go from 500 megawatts per annum to the 1 gigawatt that we'll need to see each year for the next 15 years. So this is where current policy has got us. And the next slide I'll show is where current policy has got us in terms of the rate of grant of planning applications. Obviously, before you can get any consented and installed capacity, it needs to be applied for consent granted, and then a lot of other stars need to align before we get to it being fully built out. The last 10 years, we've seen 490 applications submitted for wind farms in Scotland, onshore wind, but with a shakeout of applications being withdrawn, applications being refused, the run rate on average over the last 10 years is 29%. So that's a high rate of attrition, 70% unsuccessful applications. Slightly better if you're dealing with a single turbine application, but not much better. If it's been refused, you then get a second bite at the cherry, albeit that adds, of course, delay and cost. But looking at the statistics for appeals, over the last 10 years, the same period, the total number of appeals, 237, with an average rate of grant of 42%. So taking first instance 29% and appeal 42%, together the overall chance of success for a planning application for a wind farm in Scotland is still just under 50%. So it's high risk if you're looking to attract the billions of investment that will be needed to achieve what we're looking to do in the next 15, never mind 25 years. High rate of attrition, and especially in a climate emergency. Interestingly, since the climate emergency was declared in 2019, unfortunately, these rates of grant of appeal have reduced. With this year to date, particularly grim reading, we're sitting at 2 decisions to grant out of a total of 7, 5 refusals, so 29% rate of grant at the moment. And here's part of the reason why we're seeing so many refusals. I'll not read this out, it's very dense text, but I think the slides will be made available later. But basically, this was it's an extract from a planning appeal decision notice issued in February. And what the reporter who heard that appeal is basically saying here is there may be a climate emergency, but until planning policy is changed, we need to apply the old policy. So that underlines the need for planning policy updates and for a recalibrating of the planning balance, because applying the old policy, the decision in this case was to refuse the appeal. And the second quote is from a decision notice issued in April of this year, where the reporter took a different view. You could give more weight to the climate emergency in the planning balance without there being express policy change. But that sounds positive, yet the decision was still weighing that balance to refuse that application, that appeal. So we need consistency and clarity within the planning system. Something needs to change fundamentally if we're going to treble current capacity. Obviously, as I've said, not every project that gets consented will get built. So we need to see a huge number of new applications and a much improved rate of grant if we've got any chance of getting where we need to be by 2035 and then on to 2045. Things are better looking at larger scale projects and looking at the pipeline of projects that are at the pre-application scoping stage. The majority of those applications are Section 36 consent. So not planning applications as we've looked at, but Section 36 consents determined by the Scottish Government and applied for to their centralised energy consents unit. There's a better hit rate in terms of Section 36 consent decisions. Overall, a 68% chance of success. And this year, good news, we're at 83%. There's only been one refusal so far this year. So good news in the context of a climate emergency. But there are still, the stats are not great if you have to go to a public local inquiry. This year, none of the decisions have involved the application going to a public local inquiry. If they had, the average consent rate, if your application goes to a public local inquiry, reduces from 100% chance down to 50% chance. So again, local authority objection, which triggers the need for a public local inquiry, and its assessment of the planning balance is still fundamental to this Section 36 consent process. So planning policies and the attitudes of local planning authorities and the reporters who lead these inquiries and make a recommendation to the Scottish ministers whether or not to grant, also important in the context of larger schemes, as well as the smaller schemes we've looked at earlier. So I hope that's helped to show where the planning balance is currently sitting. And in the last 10 refusals of Section 36 consent applications, 7 of those have been outside any designated landscape area, wildland or a national scenic area or certainly a national park, yet they have been refused on landscape grounds. So a lot of what's sitting behind these numbers is the issue of landscape and visual impact of onshore wind. But I hope this has helped set the context for where we're at the moment. The request isn't for the climate emergency to become some sort of trump card in the planning process, but it's got to be given greater weight than it currently is. And arguably too much weight is given to other factors, in particular landscape and visual impacts. We need to get the scales recalibrated and then apply new weight to the same issues in light of the changed circumstances that we find ourselves in. Can't continue on a business as usual basis and hope to achieve where we need to get to for our net zero ambitions. So that was what I wanted to contribute for now, George. Hand back to you.
Thanks very much, Jennifer. That was fascinating. Really interesting sets of figures and charts. The rate of deployment appears to be way below what's needed, worryingly so. And as you say, the emerging theme appears to be landscape issues. So onto our landscape experts, Jennifer Skrinka. I'd like to introduce Jennifer. She's a chartered landscape architect and environmental consultant with 35 years of professional experience. She joined ASH in 1994, became a director in 2001. She's helped secure consent for some of the largest onshore renewable energy related infrastructure projects in Scotland. And as a professional practitioner then, Jennifer, would you like to give us your perspective? Thank you.
Thank you, George. Yes, good afternoon. Yes, as George said, I would like to give a landscape practitioner's perspective, having worked in the renewable energy sector for the last 20 years. The next slide, please. The 5 areas that I will cover are an overview of current landscape and visual impact assessment practices for onshore wind projects, referred to as LVIA or Landscape and Visual Assessment from now on. The main opportunities for future wind development and the implications on landscape and visual practices. Examples of how taller turbines appear in the landscape. I'll identify the main hurdles from a landscape and visual perspective. And lastly, I'll be looking at proportionality and changes in the Scottish landscape. Next slide, please. There's no doubt that landscape policy and landscape practices are key considerations in the development of taller turbines. Current landscape practices are centred on GLVIA3, the assessment Bible, which is now in its 3rd version and is used by landscape practitioners for all types of development. GLVIA3 states that LVIA is a tool to identify and assess significance of effects of change resulting from developments in both the landscape and on people's views and visual amenity. So the LVIA identifies if the change resulting from the development is significant, and it is for others to provide an opinion on the acceptability of the findings in the planning statement. Next slide, please. The opportunities for future growth in the wind industry will inevitably focus on repowering of existing sites and extensions, as well as some new sites. One might expect applications for repowered sites and extensions to be relatively quick to gain consent. However, in my experience, this has not been the case. In fact, quite the contrary. Although local communities are often more relaxed about a repowered proposal or an extension, as they have become accustomed to the operational site, repowering is seen by some stakeholders as an opportunity to remove turbines from the site and not replace them. Next slide, please. I'm now going to show you photo montages from a couple of recent projects. The first montage illustrates a wind farm extension on a mountain plateau, but the existing wind farm is barely visible from this view. There were just a couple of tips. The upper image is a wireline of the proposed new turbines, and the lower image is the photo montage. We assess the effects from this view as being moderate and therefore significant. This is largely because although there are existing turbine tips in the view and the new turbines sit well in the landform, there is a large change in the view with the introduction of the new turbines. Next slide, please. This second image illustrates a proposed wind farm as seen from an adjacent settlement, where the effects are considered to be minor and therefore not significant. On the wireline, on the upper image, the grey turbines are existing and the red turbines are proposed. The viewer has to look through the existing turbines, which are 110 metres tall, in order to see the new turbines, which are 200 metres to tip. So this montage shows how different sizes of turbines can sit well side by side in the landscape. Next slide, please. Some of the key hurdles that I've identified from a landscape and visual perspective are Next slide, please. Some of the methodologies and guidance documents developed for wind farm assessment are conflicting and contentious, with landscape capacity studies, which is currently under review, being particularly problematic. The topic of wildland and the identification of wildland areas and the ongoing guidance surrounding wildland areas could take up my full 8-minute slot, as I see it as a key obstacle to the development and change in Scotland. Ring fencing vast tracts of Scotland with fixed boundaries and effectively preventing change of any scale in or near these areas is not a proportionate approach to development, in my view. The preparation of visualizations has become very onerous, with conflicting guidance and the requirement to take all photographs in perfect conditions, which is extremely challenging. There should be more recognition that the photomontage is just a tool and not the assessment, in my view. Next slide, please. Lastly, in terms of hurdles, I want to touch on the current requirement for nighttime viewpoint photography in the assessment of lit turbines over 150 meters tall. This slide illustrates the huge amount of kit required for nighttime photography. The full kit for one person weighs about 20 kilograms. Next slide, please. To best illustrate the challenges of taking photographs during the hours of darkness, I've included a letter from a professional photographer that we use, written to the Landscape Institute after undertaking a nighttime shot on a Munro Peak in February of this year for a different client. I won't read it out, but this photographer, who is very fit and healthy and spends a lot of time climbing mountains and taking photographs, outlines in this letter the considerable technical challenges and physical challenges, and also the alarming health and safety risks that he was exposed to. The current requirement for photographs to be taken on remote areas at night, included in Nature Scott's latest guidance, September 2020, makes me feel very uncomfortable, as it is putting people's lives at risk, and for what benefit? In my view, this is not a proportional approach. Next slide, please. I believe that a better alternative to night photography is the manipulation of daytime photographs using digital techniques. This is obviously quicker, cheaper, and a whole lot safer, and the results are often better too. Next slide, please. Lastly, I want to draw attention to the layering and complexity of Scottish landscapes. In the recent past, changes brought about by the introduction of commercial forestry and other land management practices are highly visible, but they are accepted as being necessary. In addition to this, there have been huge changes brought about by the construction of roads, railways, and canals. And perhaps the most relevant are the changes that were brought about by the last green energy revolution about just over 60 years ago, with the introduction of large-scale hydro, involving the flooding of vast tracts of land and the introduction of large new structures. There was great opposition to hydro development at the time, but the reservoirs, dams, power stations, and other structures have now become much loved iconic symbols of Scotland and are protected at the highest level. Next slide, please. I want to leave you with a photo montage that we produced for one of our current projects. It illustrates the incredible potential that Scotland still has for renewable energy. It shows a site that is 600 metres above sea level and sits in a natural bowl. 100 megawatts operational hydro scheme already sits on the site, and a 228 megawatt operational wind farm is located amongst the hydro structures. In addition to this, a proposed 150 megawatt wind farm extension is included in the montage, amounting to an impressive 478 megawatts of renewable energy on one site. A lot of work went into the design of the three schemes to ensure that significant effects were limited. However, even this proposed extension, with its fantastic wind resource, existing infrastructure, relative lack of significant effects, and considerable support from the local community, looks like its path through the consented process is not going to be straightforward. So in response to the title of the webinar, from a landscape practitioner's perspective, I don't believe that we have currently got the balance right, and certainly not in the face of a climate emergency. We need visionary leadership from government, passed down to its advisors, and we need to act quickly or we're going to miss the moment. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. I recognise that that location in your last slide. Fantastic project. In fact, when that one was struggling through the system and through court cases as well, brought by anti-wind farm campaigners, I was always of the view that if there was no wind farms anywhere in the UK and someone proposed a location for one big one, you know, you would be hard pushed to find a more suitable location. But that's my impartial chairness coming in, so I need to rein that in. My apologies. But thanks very much for that. That was really insightful. So our final speaker to make a presentation is Heather Donald. Now, Heather heads up project consents for SSE Renewables. She oversees the team responsible for consenting and land acquisition in onshore wind. Heather's a chartered town planner with over 20 years development consenting experience in both public and private sectors. So Heather, please give us your perspective as a developer on whether we are getting the balance right in the planning system, please.
Thanks, George. Thanks for the introduction, and thanks very much for the invite to participate in today's session and give a developer's perspective on what we think, or what I think about, you know, whether we're getting the balance right. So if we can have the first slide, please. Yep, thank you. Okay, so are we acting with appropriate urgency? I pose this question because it's the terminology that's been used in the UK Committee on Climate Change report in 2019, which says we absolutely need to. So on the one hand, over the last 4 or 5 years, we've seen hugely supportive policy emerging at an international and national UK and Scottish government level. Not to mention the sort of the climate change protests and the increasing awareness of the issues in the wider population. So in November 2016, we obviously had the signing of the Paris Agreement. In 2017, we had the Scottish Energy Strategy published, which recognised onshore wind as a key contributor to the delivery of renewable energy targets. In May 2019, we obviously had the Committee on Climate Change's report published, Reaching Net Zero, which sets out a requirement to quadruple renewable energy by 2050 to respond to the targets. And we had a climate emergency declared during the same year, and then later on last year, the targets became legally binding as well. And then obviously earlier this year, we had the announcement that onshore wind was to be eligible to compete in the next Contract for Difference round. So the list's not exhaustive, but it's all very positive stuff, and all very much welcomed by the industry. However, on the other hand, at the same time, we've got a planning system which is still relying on NPF3 and SPP, which are outdated now, and the situation is very different to what it was in 2014 when these documents were published. We've also recently seen the Scottish Government consulting on removing an existing presumption in favour of sustainable development, as is currently set out in SPP. We've seen new emerging local development plans coming forward that just don't prioritise the climate emergency or net zero targets, and they lack ambition in terms of the targets. They also continue to refer to landscape capacity studies, which are completely out of kilter with the international and national policy agenda, and also advances in turbine technology. And they're just, you know, inherently negative and look to limit turbine numbers and overall tip height. And they often also conclude that there's just no capacity for commercial scale wind turbines in huge swathes of their subject area. We've also seen feedback coming from decision makers that actually the declared climate emergency hasn't really made any difference to them in terms of the way they process applications at the moment. And we're just seeing more and more sites refused and delayed through public local inquiry. So we've got this kind of policy hiatus, and 2020 was supposed to have been the year that NPF4 emerged to bridge this gap and provide the strategic direction that's needed. And the expectation was that it would be making its way through the parliamentary process around about now. And that this would help bridge this gap between the positive and encouraging statements made at national government level and then the often, you know, negative policy and experiences we sometimes have at the local level. So the delays to NPF4 were maybe inevitable given the turn that 2020 has taken. However, there's no getting away from the fact that the planning system's not caught up yet, and it's a gap that needs to be addressed. And hopefully, through this much anticipated autumn statement, we'll get this gap filled, and maybe be able to act with the appropriate urgency that's required of us. So next slide, please. So just to sort of recap on the targets themselves, the UK has to reach net zero emissions by 2050 and Scotland by 2045. There's a requirement to quadruple the renewable energy that we have by 2050 to meet the targets. And for onshore, that means we need 35 gigawatts in the system by 2035. And in relation to Scotland, Scottish Renewables have calculated that means up to about 24 gigawatts by 2035. So we have 8 gigawatts at the moment, and that basically means we have to treble that in the next 14 years, and it means building out at least a gigawatt or equivalent of each year for the next 14 years. So if I can have the next slide, please. So very briefly, just from an SSE perspective, we've got around 2 gigawatts of operational onshore wind in the UK and Ireland at the moment, and a gigawatt in development. I mentioned these particular projects because we're obviously very pleased to be constructing both Viking Wind Farm in Shetland at the moment and Gordonbush Extension. I suppose the point I would make about these, and the contribution of those two projects, I should say, is about 500 megawatts in terms of this rush towards the targets. But on Viking, I just make the point that Viking was 17 years in the development process. So if we're to act with this appropriate urgency, we can't see development projects taking that long in the system, and need to happen more quickly. On Tangi, I mentioned Tangi just because it's our first repowering proposal, which in Argyll and Butte, which if developed out will see an 18 megawatt project converted into an 80 megawatt project. So going from 22 turbines to 16 turbines. But I suppose what I would say about Tangi is that the consented project does involve a doubling of the original land take. So not every repower site will be able to achieve the same uplift in output terms. And we're obviously still to get this one from the desktop to the point of actual delivery and construction, and there's still a few constraints to deal with. And the other point is just that although we didn't have a PLI for Tangi, and there was a lot of opposition from statutory consultees on this one, less so from members of the community. But it wasn't really any easier to consent this than it was to consent other projects. And I think going forward, repowering the existing 8 gigawatts that we have is going to be really important in terms of meeting and retaining, the targets that we've been set. So if I can have the next slide, please. So I suppose we're really enthusiastic about the national and international policy position, and we're confident about the targets we've been set, and we're confident as well that onshore wind is a technology that can be built out cost effectively within the timescales required, and that it can play this major part in delivering the net zero target emissions. But the constraints facing onshore wind development shouldn't be underestimated, and projects are not getting any easier. I mean, it sounds obvious, but windy sites are more critical than ever. Hard constraints like land and grids are not getting any easier with larger turbines. The focus on local landscape impacts hinders progress towards these targets, undoubtedly, and it pushes sites outside of optimal wind speed areas, which will more than likely make the projects unviable or require large tip height increases to improve project viability. As an industry, we often try and find technical solutions to our problems, and we often rely on lessons learned through building out projects, or we wait for technological advances to solve problems. But landscape impacts can't necessarily be solved through the same means, and we need a political and a policy solution to solve this one. And the other point I'd make is that whether the project is competing in a CFD auction or it's being developed out on a fully merchant basis, it doesn't really change the way we develop projects. You won't necessarily know in the early development phases what route to market your project will have, and the auctions are going to be hugely competitive, and not all sites will be successful, so they're by no means a sort of silver bullet. So if I can have the next slide, please. So in terms of getting the balance right, it's been said already, but we can't simply rely on business as usual if we're to meet the targets. Local landscape impacts are currently tilting the balance in the wrong direction, in my view. And it's obviously vital that delivering net zero carbon is at the heart of Scotland's planning system, and NPF4 is clearly, that's central to achieving this. From NPF4, we'd like to see identify tackling the climate emergency as the principal and overarching policy consideration to which all other policies are subordinate. And we think it should include a presumption in favour of all development that supports renewable energy targets. We also need to see updated landscape and natural heritage policy coming through, which with climate change objectives and renewable energy gaining priority status. In terms of spatial frameworks, where they are overly negative and restrictive, these need to be overhauled. Instead, landscape sensitivity studies should be used, which don't dictate the size of turbines or place a cap on development. In terms of repowering and life extension, we'd like to see a presumption in favour of repowering and life extensions, and that includes larger turbines and which can accommodate modern technology, and particularly where existing grid infrastructure exists. I mentioned Tangi earlier, and based on that example, it needs to be easier to consent repowering projects. And as well as that, we need additional megawatts as well. In terms of wildland, ideally it should be removed as a policy. These areas have thwarted the development of onshore wind, and they preclude access to the best wind resource we have in Scotland, and that's within the mapped areas, but also nearby. But as an absolute minimum, wildland areas needs to be reassessed in light of the climate emergency. So those are some thoughts for now, but I look forward to the open discussion shortly. Thank you.
That's great. Thanks very much, Heather. Stimulating input there. A lot to chew on. And many thanks to all the speakers there. So before we open up the discussion to you, the audience, and also between the panelists, I'd like to introduce our two other panelists who've just joined us. That's Colin McHale he's a member of Children Scotland's Changing Our World Advisory Group and is active in climate change and works for a range of organisations with the aim of defending and promoting children's human rights. So, Col, would you like to make a few introductory remarks?
Yeah, that's great. So I think as young people become kind of more and more involved with the climate movement, as we kind of do every day now, which is amazing, it's vital that kind of as a demographic, we are consulted on the climate emergency, obviously, which is why it's kind of lovely to be invited along today. I think that planning is something, and energy actually is something that slips under the radar of kind of my generation when it comes to thinking about climate change, which is a real shame because of how important it is. And I think the challenge for us today is working out how young people can best involve themselves in an industry which can seem quite technical for us and quite kind of sometimes maybe difficult to access for us. It can't be group planning, partly because of how important it is with the kind of easily accessible causes and methods of climate change, if you know what I mean, when we're talking about kind of the 5p bag charge and things like that. It's not that simple, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. And I think that as young people become more kind of aware of climate causes and things like whether it be kind of holding global corporations to account over ethical climate solutions, or kind of criticizing global systems over their own kind of climate killing, if you like, approach to things. Young people's knowledge of the climate emergency grows every day, and specifically with regard to planning, that's a good thing, because as I've said, planning can be a technical issue, and working out whether we have the balance right. To do that, I think we have to involve young people in the discussion. And to do that, as I said, we have to kind of make things slightly less technical. Does that make sense? I think that's the way we involve young people in the climate movement, and it's the way that we've come on leaps and bounds. And as I've said, it's amazing to be here today, and we have to keep getting the message out that these kind of forums are open to young people and that young people can engage. And although, like me coming along today, in terms of business acumen and that kind of thing, we lack, but in terms of knowledge of climate and in terms of insights on our own future, we don't. And that's something that we can build on and that young people can become more and more involved with. Thank you very much.
That's fantastic, and you're very welcome. And it's a thing that is close to my heart too. You know, when you're developing projects or you're engaging in energy debates, you don't get young people getting too involved in it. And it's really great that you've joined us here. Before we get into other more detailed discussion, though, I should introduce Robbie Kernahan. He's the Director of Sustainable Growth at Nature Scot, that's Scotland's Natural Heritage Agency, and he leads the organisation's strategic vision to secure greater investment in nature and to tackle the twin challenges of climate change and biodiversity loss. So over to you, Robbie, to make some introductory remarks.
Good afternoon. Thank you, George. Nice to be here virtually, and I'm definitely not a young person, but nice to hear from Call too and get his views. I am one of the directors of Nature Scot, and as George said, we are Scotland's nature agency. And again, for those in the audience that may not know, I mean, our role is to improve our natural environment in Scotland and inspire everyone to care more about it. So all of nature in Scotland, our key habitats, our landscape, all of our green space and our native species, to make sure it's maintained and enhanced and indeed bring us all benefits. Indeed, over the course of the next hour or so, I might argue that it's all of our jobs to achieve that balance in the sensitive management of our natural world and in order to maintain and enhance biodiversity. But in the context of today's discussion, I think, you know, Nature Scot's role is to provide advice to planning authorities. We are not the regulator here, but we do want to help inform those regulators to make sure we get that balance right between nature and development, and to do so according to current policy and the regulatory context. So really interested to hear the presentations so far about some of the challenges we're currently facing. And of course, in the context of a climate emergency and the biodiversity crisis, because those two things are inextricably linked. What does a green recovery actually entail? Yeah, really looking forward to the discussion, picking up on some of the points other panelists have made and the questions as and when they come in.
Okay, thanks very much. I just want to give people the results of the polling, just as a way to stimulate further thoughts on discussion. The first question was that a statement that Scotland's planning system works really well, and we are getting the balance right in decision making to help tackle climate change. 0% agreed strongly, 16% agreed, 29% neither agreed nor disagreed, 45% disagreed, and 8% disagreed strongly. So I think a pretty clear message there. And the second question was, given the climate emergency, public support, and the need to treble onshore wind capacity, should landscape effects be given less weight in the planning decision-making process than climate change? Pretty overwhelming, 62% said no, said yes, sorry. The heart started fluttering there. And 26% said no, with 12% saying don't know. So kind of fairly consistent and clear message there that perhaps landscapes effects be given less weight in the planning decision-making process. And that perhaps there's a number of questions. I'd like to just kick off the discussion for all panelists with this question. And obviously feel free to respond to the polls when you answer this point. But by my calculation, looking at Jennifer Ballantyne's slides, the average rate of deployment over the last 3 years, we would see Scotland achieving the 24 gigawatt minimum capacity, which is needed by 2035 at the latest, by 2090. So that's the kind of trajectory we're on. And my real question is, should we as a country commit to this level of deployment by 2030 or 2035? And should we have a planning system that's directed to achieve it? Or should we accept that subjective landscape issues put a ceiling on what we can deliver? So I'd just like to invite panel members to respond to the polls and to that initial question. Who would like to go first?
Happy to jump in there. I mean,
Yep.
George, yeah, I mean, I definitely think we've got to commit. We've got to try, and we've got to sort of, if we're going to fail, at least we'll have tried. We've got to give it our best shot. But I mean, this is one of the main routes to tackling the climate emergency. That's not an option. We've got to do something, and we've got to do something major. It's the main route to keeping the lights on, in fact, because over this period, traditional generating stations, Hunterston, Torness, we've seen Long Gannet close. That we need to replace what's traditionally been our electricity generating fleet. So otherwise, if we don't do this, there's going to be major power outages, shortages, having to import electricity rather than with the sort of renewable resources that we've got actually being a net exporter. And I think the opportunity here isn't purely about energy production or climate change. It's also an economic driver that this could become a major industry at the heart of the Scottish economy, in the same way that oil and gas has been at the heart of the Scottish economy for 40 years. Onshore wind could be at the heart of the Scottish economy, driving a green recovery that we've heard a lot about over the last 6 months of the COVID crisis. Billions of pounds of investment, a large percentage of local content that you get with onshore wind. So I think we should all want this and all be striving to achieve this as hard as we can.
Yeah, and to respond to somebody else who's coming on the chat there questioning, why should we bother with onshore wind? Isn't offshore going to do it all? I think that just to be clear on that, I think that's really when you're talking about 24 gigawatt, you're talking about the advice from Climate Change Committee.
Correct.
Who also say we need offshore as well. Is that right?
I saw that question, and there's sort of three things you could pick up on that. They're saying, why do we need onshore when we've got so much offshore? Well, the Committee on Climate Change is saying we need all of this. We need onshore, we need offshore, we need solar. There's no technology is the only answer. We need it all. Secondly, to suggest that there's minimal landscape impact with offshore wind. There have been offshore applications refused on landscape grounds, so I don't think that's a correct statement either. There are landscape issues associated with offshore, or when the offshore energy is brought onshore. There's cabling and substations onshore which also have landscape impacts. And thirdly, there are other ecological impacts, navigational impacts, fishing impacts of offshore. So, I mean, we as a firm do a lot of offshore wind consenting work, and believe me, that is not an easy process. So it's not one or other, or pick a winner here. We've got to drive everything forward at the same pace and with the same ambition.
Yeah, sure. And Robbie, can I turn to you? It's one of your fellow advisory bodies, I guess. You advise government. Climate Change Committee advises government. That's what their recommendation is. Would you support the setting of a target for new onshore wind build? You're on mute. Sorry.
Yeah, thank you, George. And in terms of targets, before I come to that, it's just picking up on the reflection. I think we probably all recognise the need for some change within the planning system. And your question is really, how radical do we want to be? I think what we would be arguing for is a stronger plan-led approach, some greater vision, ambition and direction, because what we do want is clarity, I think, and certainty for investors and communities. And I'm going to frame that in the way that I think what we really want is a shift in planning culture which delivers more win-wins. because it's not surprising that, from me to say this, but landscapes are important. We mustn't forget that, and I think we can do both, protect them and deliver on renewables. I'm not saying that's easy, but I actually think, despite the fact that the challenge facing us, we've actually made a pretty good job of that to date, and I think one of the reasons we're seeing support for renewables and turbines terrestrially is because that they're well sited, they're well designed, and that's why there's support for them. I would hate to see that support decline because they're poorly sited and poorly designed. So we'll maybe come back to that, but just picking up on, I think Jennifer's point about offshore, and our desire to move to a more plan-led approach, and away from the, I suppose, market-led and opportunistic approach we've seen to date. Incidentally, that's what we've just seen with the publication of Marine Scotland's sectoral plan for offshore wind last week. We've identified 15 plan option areas, preferred areas for development for commercial wind farms. That's not to take away from all of the consenting challenges that they pose, but I think it's determined after 2 years of consultation and sustainability appraisal, and that is probably what we'd like to see happen in a not dissimilar fashion terrestrial, that plan-led approach. So there's my starter for 10.
Okay, thanks, Robbie. And what do you think, Heather? Should we set this target, and should landscape be less important? You're on mute.
We're all going to do this at least once. I think I think targets are important. I think I think anything we can do to drive this kind of urgency in the process and move things more quickly is helpful. I mean, I agree with the sentiment that the planning system has worked very well so far, and I think we have done a very good job of siting and designing wind farms in the landscape. And I'm not, there's no suggestion that we should open floodgates and start designing them poorly and siting them inappropriately. But I think what we're seeing is just layer upon layer upon layer of new policy coming out. And actually, when you look for new wind farms now, if you map, wind resource areas and you map wildland areas, for example, alongside all the nationally significant designations that we all, there's no dispute over the impacts on those or protecting those, you're left with very little. And I think what I'm really keen to see is a system that allows for the sort of advances in modern technology, in terms of modern turbines and allowing us to build out modern turbines. So yeah, I think targets are good. They should never be a cap, though. In order to decarbonise, heating and transport, the Committee on Climate Change is quite clear that we need, we need to be able to power that by renewable sources. So, whether it comes from onshore and offshore and at what speed it comes at, it's all to play for. But certainly onshore's got a big part to play in that. And if targets help us get there, then yeah, I'd be all for that.
George, can I come back on one or two things? Just so, again, just some additional context, I suppose, about wildland. So nationally, I think the wildland areas comprise about 20% of Scotland, and 3/4 of that, it's not just landscape issues. There's a whole host of challenges in there and constraints, you might perceive them, because there are areas that are important for biodiversity or for peatlands or for other issues which are hugely important. So I'll be interested in Cole's view just in a minute about a young person's perspective, because since National Planning Framework 3 was published in 2014, we've had over 50 small-scale hydro schemes within wildland areas. So they're not a barrier per se to development, but we need to be, I suppose, thinking about the best mix of all of these renewable developments to get to the target. So I think we also have to recognise the wealth of other things that wildland bring us in terms of benefits to people and people of Scotland, as well as weighing up the challenges for terrestrial generation of energy as well. So I don't know, Cole, if you've got any views on wildland areas, I'd be really interested to hear them. I
think in general, I think landscape concerns, we need to be mindful of the fact that it's a privilege, really. It's not like, as we need to remember, we talk about urgency a lot, and if we're looking at kind of 2090 predictions, and I mean, even if we can bring that estimate down, which we will do, but even when that figure comes down, we're going to still be well past the point where effects of climate change are more than irreversible. And at that point, we have to remember that landscape, concerns about landscape specifically, is as important as it is just now. It is a luxury that we have at our disposal, given the fact that we are still able to, or there is still some hope that we will be able to reverse the effects of the kind of climate emergency. And I think that young people as a whole, I feel strange speaking on behalf of my generation, but I suppose that's my job. But I think young people understand the benefit of renewable energy, specifically wind farms. And I don't think if you did poll younger generations, there would be a tiny percentage who posed any kind of opposition to turbines or to kind of windmills as a whole, purely because of the kind of increase in awareness that's gone on over the last 5 years. And I mean that kind of physically manifested itself in the marches in Edinburgh and Glasgow in September last year. And I think that kind of serves to prove that there isn't so much of a concern as people seem to think amongst young people about the kind of visual impacts of onshore wind, I think.
Yeah, I think I think Robbie, SNH's own polling regularly shows that there's a kind of rump of people who just don't like the look of turbines. I think it varies between 11 and 14%, if my memory serves me right. And the 79% of people generally actually support onshore wind. Is there any kind of views? I mean, Jennifer, you might have to have some, Jennifer S, I should say, you might have some comments to make on discussion so far in relation to, you know, are turbines in the environment a bad thing? Do we get too uptight about it? Do we try too hard to hide them away from people or hide them away from the top mountains in the middle of the night? Or are we getting carried away?
Unmute. I suppose that's why I showed the slide of the change that has occurred in Scotland over the years. I think there are mixed views. I mean, we identify if there is a large change. We call that significant if we believe it is a large change. But in terms of whether that's adverse or not, I think the first photo montage that I showed, you know, the turbines actually were well composed. They were sort of sitting in a slight sort of dip. So, you know, we've identified the significant effects because it's a change, but whether that's unacceptable, that's why I was saying it's really for others to decide that. But in terms of wild land, it's the wild land areas, it's the mass sort of creation of these areas, and they are effectively a designation, whereas before wildland areas were in place, you know, as landscape architects, landscape practitioners, we always looked at wildness and wildland qualities. We looked at it as part of the landscape character assessment and, you know, recognised the value of it, the importance of it. And when search areas were first brought in, before wildland areas were about, that was quite useful because that was something that we could comment on, but it meant that each site was looked at in its own merits. I think what we've got now is these just blanket no-go areas, and there isn't the opportunity to look at them in their own merits because they're just no-go zones. And it's not just within those wildland areas, it's all around them as well. So it's not even a fixed barrier, it's beyond the barrier. So I really do feel that because they are the areas that have got the most, largely the potential for these large scale turbines because of the scale of the landscape. I think that the example that I showed, the simple large scale landscapes are the best landscapes to absorb these large turbines. So if you can't put them there, we're really going to be struggling. I mean, you know, I suppose the alternative is you put them up adjacent to settlements, which is not going to go down well. So I think It's the approach to wildland areas that I think I struggle with most, because I do believe that wildland qualities, wildness in Scotland is something that we do want to preserve, but just not on this, in the way that it's been gone about, I suppose, is what I'm object to.
Okay, thanks for that. There's hundreds of questions coming in now, and we simply must ask some on behalf of the audience. There's an elephant in the room, according to someone. Don't we need massive pumped hydro energy storage to handle variable renewable energy from onshore developments? I suppose, Heather, that should go to you. You're on mute.
Sorry. Yeah, so we have just recently been granted consent for Corrie Glass in the Highlands, which is a 1,500 megawatt pumped hydro project, which will be a pretty major development if we manage to get that off the ground. So so yeah, it's exciting times. It is. It's about this mix. I think it's I don't think the answer is to do everything offshore, because ultimately offshore has to come onshore, and that requires huge upgrades and huge kind of onshore works associated with offshore. So it's not just as simple in landscape terms to say put everything offshore. It's very much going to require a mixture of different things.
Okay, thanks for that. And I've got someone calling us boomers. I think we've answered that. I think we've answered the boomer question already on the combination of offshore and onshore wind. There's an interesting question here from someone around the draft national planning framework, which is due out next year. Should it go as far as providing principal consent for projects which are located in areas that are not classed as protected designations, for example, national parks, national scenic areas, as part of a forthcoming spatial framework, i.e. that would be a higher bar for refusing consent? Jennifer, I think that's one of the Jennifers.
I think there's something to be said for that. I think there's a definite requirement to change the mood music, to create a step change here, and to create a leg up for renewable technologies, because it's just tilt the balance in favour of addressing climate change and decarbonising our economy, and only if there were adverse impacts that significantly outweighed those enhanced elements of addressing climate change and decarbonising the economy could there be a refusal. I mean, as I think both Jennifer and Heather have said, I mean, this isn't about development absolutely anywhere. So there still will be some areas, national scenic areas, the national parks, which I think are rightly no-go, but add wildland into that equation, add a whole load of other untested subjective designations in, and you soon get to, well, we're already at 50% of the country covered by what's called Group 1 and Group 2 areas in the current policy, and add local landscape designations into that, you soon get to very much less, 25% or something. And where's the wind resource? Where's the grid connections in that undesignated land? So we need to level the playing field, but I would say even more, create a presumption in favour of renewable energy development unless there are significant adverse impacts which are not acceptable given the climate emergency and what we're trying to do here to also kickstart our economy.
And what you're saying there about all of the other constraints, grid, land, wind, all of that stuff, that means basically Scotland is not going to be carpeted in turbines. That's not what the industry wants. But Robbie, to come back to your point about a plan-led system and a special plan for large turbines, I wonder if you could elaborate on how you would see that working, taking on board all of the other issues. We know from Wales, for example, that they attempted a plan-led approach for large-scale development and essentially failed miserably, didn't even meet half their target over 15 years. So could you elaborate a little bit more on what Nature Scott thinks would work in hitting 24 gigawatts by 2035 from a plan-led system?
Well, I will try my best, George. I'm not a planner, but I think from our point of view, we'd rather see a planning system that plans, because I think that's important. But I think to support some of that ambition, which we obviously support, because I think, as I said, the climate crisis and the biodiversity crisis are inextricably linked. So our drive to net zero and all the things that we will see in the climate change plan update in December, we'll need to look at renewable energy. It'll need to look at heating. It'll need to look at transport and infrastructure. It'll need to look at land use. And we've got a stake in a number of those: active travel, trying to reduce the demands on electricity, how we can better use land to store and sequester carbon. There's a number of things there that we want to come through the climate change plan update. But coming back to national planning framework and what we would like to see, so an earlier steer on the relative balance, I think, of interests, and a stronger steer probably on the location of renewable energy development has got to be helpful for everybody, I think. But we want to see that regulation, I think, framed by collaboration. And again, I can't really comment in depth about the wealth situation, but locally in Scotland, I think we've got actually quite good examples of upstream engagement, good close collaboration to make things happen. And as I said, that inclusive and integrated place-based planning is what we want to see. Now, I think we all, again, recognise some of the deficiencies in some of the local development plans and some of the emerging spatial strategies not working, but we have that knowledge. So I think coming together to think about, well, what is it that we want to change to better respond to the climate emergency will put us on a much more solid footing. And it's a shame, I think, that we do find ourselves in a situation where national planning framework and therefore planning policy is playing catch up. You know, that's the situation we find ourselves in. So the sooner we can see some of that clarity coming through from Scottish Government and that trickling down into regional spatial plans, the happier I think we'll all be.
Sure. Thanks very much. Jennifer, would you like to comment on that? Is this tension, I guess, between the national imperative to deliver, let's say, 24 gigawatts of onshore wind with the parallel apparent commitment by government and various agencies to a plan-led, a sort of bottom-up local plan-led approach? You know, what happens if the local plan-led approach doesn't deliver the 24 gigawatts, and how can we make sure it's done? What's your view on that?
Yeah, I think government needs to be more hands-on in that regard then. If it's not being done properly, I think that needs to be, you know, made clear to relevant local authorities and more direction given. But I don't support a sort of Scotland-wide spatial framework or you know, the sort of plan-led approach that Robbie's talking about, because I mean, what we need is speed here as well, and to the thought of creating some sort of national plan. You can do it offshore. It takes time. Sectoral Marine Plan has taken a long time to get to where it is, and it's more achievable because there's a single landowner, if you like. The seabed is owned by Crown Estate Scotland, so you don't have those private interests also interfering with the production of that plan. Can you imagine the plan process, the plan inquiry that there would be, the consultation that would have to be required to come up with a national planning spatial framework for Scotland for onshore wind? You know, it just, it sends shivers down my spine, I've got to say. So I certainly don't support that approach. But yes, a plan-led system, and yes, we've got properly designated areas. We know where those lines are on plans, but outside those group 1 areas, it should then be about proper environmental impact assessment of specific projects in specific locations, and then applying the planning balance to those, and applying that in the face of the challenges that we face in terms of the climate emergency.
Okay, thanks, Jennifer. Anyone else got any comments on that?
I suppose I would just add, I agree in that if we went down the spatial framework, that should have been done a decade ago. I think now we just don't have time for that. It would just get bogged down in arguing about these areas, and yeah, I think we just need to get on with it and look at each site in its own merits.
Yeah, George, I agree with that, and obviously from a landowner point of view, and actually being able to acquire the land, getting the grid, these hard constraints I mentioned, I don't think you could take account of that necessarily in a strategic land plan. So just a strategic land plan that was based on sort of all the softer constraints, if you like, yeah, it fills me with a bit of dread as well. And just in terms of that question around NPF4 and whether providing a principal consent for projects which are located in areas that are not classed as protected designations, I mean, one step could be to categorise all development that goes some way to meeting the targets as having national significance. I mean, these are nationally significant targets. So I would argue that almost any development that's going some way to meeting those targets should be classed as such, and given some kind of easier path through the system, because they certainly don't get an easy path at the moment.
Okay, thanks. And just there's a related question that's come up on the chat. Putting aside professional views for a moment, I always find that quite easy. If you personally had to choose how we should relax landscape considerations, balancing the two options of being more relaxed about visual effects and more relaxed about character, i.e. between turbines being seen all around, you see them every day near where you live, or turbines just said generally become more common in some of the remoter areas, wild and inverted commas landscapes, obviously not national parks, national scenic areas, or I presume you mean choose between all of that and do nothing, this questioner. What's your preference? Cole.
Oh, I think I'd definitely like to see turbines more around us, and I think that because I think if we are recognizing the climate emergency with the kind of seriousness and urgency that we need to, there is kind of, and I don't want to sound alarmist, I know I do, but I think that if we are to take it as seriously as we have to do, and as we are going to have to do over the next 10 years, then it's only sensible that we adopt this approach. And although I think that there are going to be huge challenges with adopting this approach, least of all the attitudes that you're going to come up against, perhaps, I think that in terms of a kind of forward-thinking progressive measures, it's the only option that we have at our disposal in terms of taking the climate emergency seriously.
So, Robbie, I guess to put it, in short form, should Nature Scott just relax a bit more about landscape effects?
I'm going to come back on 2 points, George. One, I think, is that previous conversation about planning. I think the National Planning Framework and Scottish planning policy context can provide a direction to avoid that horrendous bottom-up local-led planning approach, which I think probably scares everybody. But my own personal preferences, I see turbines adding an awful lot to our landscapes. When you see them as a dynamic part of a landscape, I do think they add an awful lot. But I think in certain locations, often where we're talking about remoteness that people value and want to see protected, they're not appropriate. So whether we've got that balance right just now, again, I think that's still open for debate, but I still think the recognition that some parts of Scotland, because of their sense of remoteness, need to be protected and probably shouldn't accommodate turbines accordingly. That's my personal view. Again, but whether that is restricted to our existing national parks or national scenic areas, again, I think these are the decisions which the national planning framework could better articulate. But for me, I'm very much of a supporter of turbines in and around where we've got working landscapes, because I do think they enhance them. But where there are areas of wildness and remoteness, I think they detract from that experience.
I guess that thanks, Robbie. I guess that comes back to the rub that is coming from industry, that actually it's in those areas where the wind is, in the remote areas, and where we can get more efficient, commercially viable projects built. So I guess there's maybe some room for compromise and discussion around that. Would either of the Jennifers or Heather have any comments to make on that?
Well, I would add, Pete, that each site would need to be looked at on its own merits, but generally the larger simple landscapes do absorb the larger turbines better, and also if you've got a site where it's at a high elevation, then the turbines actually can be smaller. So for example, the example slide I showed, that where the turbines were 150 meters to tip because it was such a high altitude, whereas if you're looking at turbines in a more of an inland lower level, then they probably do need to be 200 meters to tip or taller indeed. So that is a consideration, and I suppose it comes back to where there's a brownfield site and it's a large scale landscape. If you can't get turbines, an extension of turbines there, where can you? And I think that's the frustration. It's the sort of easy sites that are struggling. So where do you go? The easy sites considered to be acceptable.
Yeah, so the system's too tightly restrictive, in other words.
Yeah, I think it's the fact that it's all very well saying, I suppose if there's certain sites that I think there should be more of a relaxed attitude to, and I think it's the sites where there is an existing presence or in terms of the repowering or extensions, and it just seems that just isn't happening. There's as tighter restrictions on these sites as others, and those sites are the ones that are making good use of the existing infrastructure. The communities have become accustomed to these areas, but it just doesn't seem to be working.
Yeah. Ultimately, George, I think Robbie alluded to this earlier. You know, the planning system is there, the planner, the planning department is there, or whoever the decision maker is, to try and, you know, weigh up the balance here, and weigh up all the different perspectives. And I think if the system was working properly and we had up to date, relevant policy, I think that'd be a lot easier for planners. I mean, I think that the planning departments have suffered over the last 10 years, obviously through massive cuts. You know, they are in a difficult position. They're dealing with a number of applications, and they're dealing with a mixed bag of applications. And I think what tends to happen is, you know, on these big projects, you know, where they're overburdened often in planning departments, you know, objections come in, and what we've seen recently is that people wait until they see some of the, particularly Nature Scot, you know, people almost put in holding responses until such time as the Nature Scot response appears. And I don't know, I'm not saying it's a laziness, but certainly there is everybody waits until we've seen Nature Scot's position on these things, and then that tends to lead to the sort of groundswell of you know, sort of views, I guess, on projects, and you know, to me, it's this lack of this direction at the right level through NPF4 that needs to help decision makers, because we're not saying that, you know, we shouldn't be going through this process and we shouldn't be properly assessing all the impacts. But I think it's just in the weighing up and in the balancing versus, you know, the impacts, you know, the adverse impacts that the EI throws up versus all the, you know, advantages we've mentioned. So around economic development and particularly meeting these targets, it's still ultimately going to fall to planners probably to try and decision makers to try and make those make that balance effectively.
Thanks.
If I'm able to just go back to the question about, you know, what would I rather see? I did when we were allowed to do it, the top loop of the North Coast 500 earlier in the year, and you know, you're driving along, you see wind turbines, you see dune ray, you see forestry, you see railways, you see you know, the other impacts that man has had on the landscape that Jennifer was alluding to earlier. There just does seem to be a double standard applied when it comes to wind, onshore wind, and, you know, excessive and disproportionate planning requirements required of onshore wind that don't apply to any other type of development. And I think we've really got to change the narrative on that. You know, I see wind turbines, I like them. I mean, maybe I am biased, can't put my professional head to one side, but I think rather than the sentiment being they're bad and need to be sold, we should embrace them and see them as the current incarnation of how we all switch on the lights, work our iPhones, and go about our daily business and power our economy. That's my view.
Okay, thanks very much. I'm just conscious that we've only got a few minutes left, and I'm sure actually we could have probably talked about wild land all day, but we would have lost our audience pretty quickly. It's been a really fascinating discussion. I think what I've taken from it is that it's a really important conversation. I think at the root of it is proportionality. It's about getting things into proportion, and whether we need to deliver on the climate emergency or not shouldn't be the question. The question should really be, how do we deliver on it? It's been really fascinating listening to the range of views and just a stimulating conversation. So just in the last couple of minutes, there's lots of questions just to run through a few. I mean, there's people talking about, one person is endorsing the plan-led approach from Robbie and saying that there's no coordination. We have another one about network connection costs and grid connections, and I think we could talk about that one all day as well. So it's been good. I think probably Judith in the background from All Energy, just to give her a big thank you, but I think the message is that we should probably revisit these issues. There's a few things, obviously over the next 12 months, there will be, we're expecting a statement on planning shortly. It'd be interesting to see what's in that. We have a lot of activity around the election next year, so things may be going into a bit of a hiatus, but it's also a good time to raise issues. And then we have the COP26 next year, and then we have the National Planning Framework next year. So it's really important that we all, we get this right. And I think the conversation today has been extremely useful, and I hope we can continue it in lots of different forums. And thanks to everybody who also tuned in and joined us. So just a warm round of applause to all of you for joining us and to the speakers. Thank you.